legislation as an attempt to come together and voice students' opinions to the university, hoping that if we join collectively, we might be able to convince the university to condemn YCT for its repeated racist and exclusionary behavior via pursuing concrete action rather than simply making statements. Over the past few days, our legislation lost more and more sponsorship from people who were originally very interested in supporting our response. The primary reason most people decided to withdraw support was because they came to the conclusion that the legislation was too extreme. Others have argued that it's very weak, if any legal basis, and especially within the context of free speech, this argument's been made repeatedly now. However, I think it's important to recognize that when we have discussions of race and racial discrimination, the radical groups are always the one whose opponents always try to silence first. They do this most easily and commonly by saying that the goal isn't pragmatic or practical, that it usually results in some kind of discussion which leads to a discussion about compromise. But the thing about compromise is that it's never equal, and radical leftists are usually on the losing side. Compromise fundamentally co-ops movements and tries to integrate it into exclusionary systems, especially systems like racism that already exist. In the context of racism, this kind of action usually ends up benefiting through racist institution rather than breaking it down, especially because that said institution appears as if it's making true progress, so people continue to support the organization. In the context of racism, specifically at UT in student government, this is what will continue to happen if we choose to compromise on this particular piece of legislation, and that's why we chose to phrase it in the way that we did. I don't think that we should approach our presentation about this legislation worried about the question of whether or not it will pass in the future. Ultimately, even if it did pass, it would be through an institution that's fundamentally rooted in upholding the very same racist and exclusionary sentiments that we're trying to condemn. SG, like other UT organizations and UT itself, has always struggled with issues of inclusivity and diversity. So even if this legislation were to pass, it would only serve to validate an organization that isn't particularly welcoming of minority students anyways. And this is why now more than ever we need to have this kind of conversation. I think people are under the assumption that racism doesn't really exist at UT, which is a really dangerous belief to hold because it's very, very present. And that was the unfortunate realization that was the most, large and explicit at the takeaway from last week's Space Survey. Racism is definitely still present on the organization, and it may not manifest specifically under what we are, normally considered to be a hate crime, right? But it's still there in the rhetorics and in the violent threats that are made in the nature of the actions, such as what happened on Thursday. Because of the very structure of this organization, I'm not sure if SG is fundamentally capable of understanding this kind of radical conversation, but it's more of a reason for us to stand by and write this kind of legislation. Other representatives are probably right in claiming that it doesn't have a legal basis, which is kind of disappointing, but not really, because I don't think that our focus tonight should be on trying to pass something legal. It's something that is supposed to effectively communicate the wishes and the sentiments of the students who were personally affected by the horrible event of last week. I personally joined SG knowing that I wanted to represent minority opinions as part of my platform. These often go unheard, and I think that this legislation represents those opinions in the best way a piece of legislation can. So, I, along with my fellow students, will continue to sponsor and support this legislation regardless of whether or not it's going to pass because of what it stands for. Even if YCT is allowed to legally stay, even if it's legally allowed to practice this kind of explicit racism, our primary concern of representatives is to voice the opinion of the students, like the ones who spoke during open forum tonight, and they seem to overwhelmingly condemn YCT.
And we are exercising our First Amendment to give them a response as to why we're opposing their existence on campus, because they have committed this since 2004. They did this in 2004, 08, 13, and they did it again last week against students of color. And those not targeted by the bake sale, once again, y'all will move on, honestly. You will forget what happened last week and y'all will go on with their lives. But those who are directly targeted by it emotionally and physically from standing there in the protest, it really, we're not free to learn in an environment that doesn't threaten us. So when our existence, it's okay, I'm gonna cry more if you do that. When our existence is under constant threat because of the lack of representation we already have, we have to deal with something like this. Like, there are 4% of black students here and 0.2% of Native Americans on campus, and they have to walk by a bake sales, like telling that they're only here because of affirmative action. And you want to support this sentiment and this argument as a body of student representatives? So we're here to let them know that the impact of freedom of speech is way more important in an environment like campus than the intent of freedom of speech. And because of the negative, the long-lasting impact that it made, I urge you to vote in favor of AR 15. And thank you so much for listening.
We will now move into a 3-minute period of question and answer, beginning with Representative Hashem.